My name is Jerry. I am 35 years old and I work as a sales executive for a multinational company. It was a Thursday afternoon. I had just finished a 2-week business trip and couldn't wait to get home to my wife, Sarah. The moment I pushed open the door to my house, I felt something was wrong. The living room was awfully quiet, and Sarah's favorite Bluetooth speaker wasn't playing her favorite jazz as usual. I walked gingerly up the stairs, my heart suddenly racing for some reason. The bedroom door was ajar, and a subtle sound came from inside. I held my breath and slowly pushed the door open. In that moment, my world fell apart. Sarah, my wife of 7 years, was entangled in our bed with a strange man. They were so caught up in their lust that they didn't even notice my presence. I felt a wave of vertigo and my stomach turned. I wanted to scream, to rush up and maul the man, but it was as if my body was out of control and I just stayed there. I don't know how long it took, maybe only a few seconds, but I closed the door silently. The sound of Sarah's gasp was cut off behind the door, but the image was seared into my mind and wouldn't go away. I mechanically stepped out of the house and into the car. The cold touch of the steering wheel sobered me up a little. I started the engine and drove aimlessly, eventually coming to a cliff on the outskirts of town somehow. The sun was setting, and I was sitting on the hood, staring at the distant horizon. 7 years of marriage just fell apart in a flash. I pulled out my cell phone, hesitated, and dialed my boss and best friend Mike's number. "Hey man, what's up?" Mike's voice came over the receiver. "Mike." My voice was hoarse. I saw Sarah with another man." There was silence on the other end of the line for a few seconds. "Where are you?" "I'll be right over." I gave my location and hung up. Suddenly, Sarah's incoming call kept flashing on the screen, but I didn't have the courage to answer it, and then I realized it was a neighbor asking Sarah why I had just come home and left in a huff. I just sat there and watched the sun sink a little bit into the horizon, like my hopes were falling with it. I don't know how long it took, but Mike's car pulled up next to mine. Without saying a word, he gave me a big hug. "Talk about it, man," Mike said softly. We sat on the edge of the cliff, and I broke off to tell what had happened. Mike listened quietly, handing me a can of beer from time to time. As night fell, the stars dotted the sky, but inside I was in darkness. "What are you going to do?" Mike finally asked. I shook my head. "I don't know. I really don't know." Just then, my cell phone vibrated once again. It was Sarah. I hesitated and finally pressed the answer button at Mike's encouraging look. "Jerry? Jerry, where are you? Please come back. Let's talk." Sarah's voice came through the receiver, tinged with sobs. I took a deep breath. "Sarah, I need some time. I don't want to see you right now." "Jerry, please, let me explain." I hung up, feeling a wave of exhaustion like I've never felt before. Mike patted me on the shoulder. "Come on, let's go ahead and stay at my place tonight. We'll figure out what to do about it tomorrow." I nodded and followed Mike off the cliff. The night wind blew against my face, bringing a hint of coolness. I knew that starting tonight, my life would face a major turning point, and I, for one, was not ready for the raging storm that was to come. That night at Mike's house, I barely slept. The image kept replaying in my head. Sarah and that man. I felt a wave of revulsion and rushed into the bathroom to dry heave for a while. Early in the morning, Mike knocked on the guest room door. "Hey man, I took the day off. Let's go out for a ride for a change of scenery." I forced a smile. "Thanks, man." We drove Mike's car all the way north along the coastline. The scenery flew by outside the car window, blue skies and bright sunshine, a stark contrast to my somber mood. "Where to?" I asked. Mike smiled mysteriously. "There's a place you'll love." A few hours later, we arrived at a quiet beach town. Mike pulled 2 surfboards out of the trunk. "Come on, let's conquer these waves." I was a little hesitant. "Man, I haven't surfed in a long time. Now would be a good time for you to get back into surfing. Trust me, this will make you feel better." I felt a sense of relief as I put on my surf suit and stepped into the cool water. Mike taught me to rediscover my balance, and soon I was able to stand up on the board without any problems. When the first big wave hit, I held my breath and paddled hard. The waves pushed me forward, and at that moment, I felt as if I were one with the sea. All my worries and pain were temporarily left behind. However, a sudden wave hit. I lost my balance and fell heavily into the water. The seawater filled my nose and mouth, salty and bitter. Just like my life at this moment, I thought bitterly. Mike swam over and tapped me on the shoulder. Is everything okay? I nodded, again. We spent the whole day in the ocean, and by the time we got back to shore, we were exhausted. And Mike suggested a bonfire on the beach with some fish and beer. As night fell, we sat around the campfire. The firelight reflected on Mike's face, and I felt a sudden pang of gratitude. Thank you, Mike, I said, for being there for me through this. Mike smiled. You're welcome, buddy. You do the same for me. We clinked our bottles and stared at the dancing flames in silence. A few cans of beer down, I felt a little dizzy in my head. You know, I snapped, I always felt like it was my fault. Maybe I've been working too much and neglecting Sarah. Mike shook his head. Don't think so. Whatever the reason, cheating was her choice and her mistake. It's not your fault. I smiled bitterly. But we've been together for 7 years. 7 years? Can you imagine? I thought we'd be together until we were old. And now? Before I could finish my sentence, I felt my throat tighten. Mike handed me another can of beer, and I drank most of it in one gulp. The alcohol started to kick in, and I felt a rush come over me. I stood up and stumbled towards the beach. Sarah, I yelled towards the dark ocean. Why? Why are you doing this to me? My voice echoed on the empty beach, but received no response. Tears flowed down uncontrollably, wetting my face with the sea. Mike came over and put his arm around my shoulders. Come on, buddy, go back to sleep. Everything will be fine tomorrow. I let Mike drag me back to the campfire. Lying on the beach, I looked up at the star-filled sky and felt more alone and lost than ever. Without realizing it, I fell asleep. The next morning, I was awakened by the cries of seagulls. My head ached and my mouth was bitter. I fumbled for my cell phone, and the screen showed a dozen missed calls and texts, all from Sarah. The latest text message reads, Jerry, please come back. We need to talk. I love you, really. I stared at the text message for a long time, not knowing how to reply. The sun shone on my face, bringing a hint of warmth. I took a deep breath and felt the salty smell of the ocean breeze. It's time to face reality, I guess. But am I really ready? When I got back to town, I still didn't have the courage to confront Sarah directly. Mike suggested I see a counselor. Maybe a professional can help you clear your head. I reluctantly agreed. The next day I arrived at Dr. Emma Watson's clinic. The waiting room had soft music and some abstract paintings on the walls that looked like they were supposed to be relaxing. But at the moment, they only made me feel more uncomfortable. Jerry, came a gentle female voice. I looked up to see a lady of about 50 or so. She smiled and held out her hand to me. I'm Dr. Emma Watson. Please follow me. Upon entering the clinic, I sat on a comfortable couch. Emma sat across from me, notepad in hand. Jerry, can you tell me what brought you here? She asked gently. I took a deep breath. I found out my wife cheated on me. Saying those words felt like going through that horrible scene all over again. Emma nodded. I'm sorry you're going through this. Can you tell me how you feel? I laughed bitterly. Feelings? I feel like I've been pushed off a tall building and I keep falling, not knowing when I'll hit bottom. I feel anger, betrayal, sadness, sometimes even wondering if I did something wrong. These feelings are normal, Jerry, Emma said. We tend to go through a complex set of emotions in these situations. It's important to recognize that your wife's behavior is not your fault. We continued to talk for about an hour. Emma listened to my account of the whole incident and how I had been feeling for the past few days. She didn't give any specific advice, but more guided me to think about my feelings and needs. On my way out, Emma suggested I move out for a while. Give yourself some space and think about what you want to do next, she said. I nodded. Thank you, Emma. After leaving the clinic, I drove back to the house. Sarah wasn't there, probably at work. I stood in our bedroom, looking at a place that was once filled with love, but now only suffocated me. I started packing. As I pulled open the closet, a picture fell out. It was a wedding picture of Sarah and I. We were smiling so brightly as if our happiness would last forever. I stared at the photo for a long time, but finally put it in my suitcase. After packing, I called my parents. Dad, can I come home for a couple days? I tried to sound normal. Of course, son. There was concern in his father's voice. Is something wrong? I took a deep breath. Wait until I get back. Half an hour later, I was standing at the door of my parents' house. My mom gave me a big hug as soon as she opened the door. Jerry, you've lost weight, she said heartily. I forced a smile. Probably too much work. We sat in the living room, and I finally got up the courage to tell them what happened. Mom cried when she heard, and Dad looked shocked and angry. That bitch, Dad cursed. How dare she do that to you? Calm down, honey. Mom patted Dad's hand, then turned to me. Jerry, we'll support you in whatever decision you make. I felt a twinge in my nose. Thank you guys. That night, I lay in my childhood bed and stared at the ceiling. The phone lit up again with a text from Sarah. Jerry, please come back. We need to talk. I turned off my phone and rolled over. I knew that sooner or later I would have to face Sarah and our marriage. But at the moment, I just wanted to escape this harsh reality for a while under the shelter of my parents. Tomorrow, I said to myself, tomorrow I'll be a little stronger. Maybe then I'll be able to find a way forward. After a few days at my parents' house, I finally made up my mind to confront Sarah, who had been texting and calling me constantly over the past few days, her tone fading from initial pleading to anger and then back to desperation. I knew I couldn't run away any longer. I grabbed my phone, took a deep breath, and texted Sarah, tonight at 8, we'll talk. Almost instantly, Sarah replied, okay, I'll wait for you to come back. At 7:50 p.m., I stood in front of my house. Once, this was my most reassuring harbor, but now it felt so strange to me. I took out my keys, hesitated, and rang the doorbell. The door opened almost immediately. Sarah stood there, her hair disheveled, her eyes red and swollen, obviously having had a rough few days as well. She reaches out towards me for a hug, but I subconsciously take a step back. Sarah's hand stopped awkwardly in midair and finally dropped feebly. Come in, she said softly. I walked into the house and the familiar furnishings sent a stab of pain through me. We sat quietly on the couch in the living room, and a suffocating silence filled the air. Finally, I spoke up, why? Sarah lowered her head and twisted her hands together. Jerry, I don't know how to explain. I said coldly, maybe you can start by telling me who he is. Sarah looked up with tears in her eyes. His name is David. He's a new co-worker at the company. We were just talking and things just got out of hand. Out of control? I felt a surge of anger rise. Sarah, you brought a strange man into our bed. That's not out of control. That's your choice. I know, Sarah choked out. I made a terrible mistake. Jerry, please forgive me. I love you, I do. I stared into her eyes, trying to find a glimmer of sincerity in them. But all I saw was remorse and fear. You love me? I laughed bitterly. If you really love me, how could you do such a thing? Sarah began to sob. I don't know. Maybe it's because you're always traveling and I feel lonely. But that's no excuse, I know. Jerry, give me a chance, we can start over. I stood up and felt a wave of vertigo. Starting over? Sarah, do you think that's possible? Every time I look at you, I remember that image. You and him. I couldn't go on. Sarah got down on her knees and grabbed my hand. Please, Jerry, I'll do anything to make it right. We can go to marriage counseling. I can quit my job. I shook her hand off. Stop, Sarah. I need time and space right now. I don't know if I can forgive you. I don't even know if I still love you. Sarah's face turned pale. Are you talking about a divorce? I took a deep breath. I don't know. But I do know that I can't live with you right now. I turned toward the door and Sarah called out behind me. Jerry, please don't go. We can talk. I can explain. I stopped but didn't look back. There's nothing left to explain, Sarah. Your behavior says it all. I opened the door and walked out. Sarah's cries came from behind me, but I didn't look back. I got into my car, started the engine, and drove away from the place that used to be my home. On the way, my tears finally fell. I don't know what the future holds. I don't know if there is any possibility of my marriage to Sarah. All I know is that at this moment, I feel more alone and lost than ever. But at least I was finally brave enough to face the truth. That may be the first step to healing. That night, I drove aimlessly around town. Streetlights swept by outside the car window, one after another, like memories of Sarah and I flashing back and forth in my mind. I finally made it back to my parents' house in the wee hours of the morning, exhausted. The next morning, I was awakened by a sharp ringing of the phone. It was an unfamiliar number. "Is this Mr. Jerry, please?" An unfamiliar female voice asked. "Yes, I am. This is Center Hospital. Your wife Sarah was in a car accident early this morning and is in the emergency room. Can you come over as soon as you can?" I felt my blood instantly freeze. I'll be right there." Hanging up the phone, I sat on my bed, my mind blank. It wasn't until my mom knocked on the door and asked if I wanted breakfast that I awoke from my dream and stumbled out of my room. "Jerry? What's wrong?" Mom asked worriedly. "Sarah, car accident, hospital," I said brokenly, hurrying to put on my shoes as I did so. Dad poked his head out of the kitchen. "I'll drive you." 20 minutes later, we arrived at the hospital. The emergency room was a hive of activity as I ran to the front desk. "This is Jerry, here to see Sarah Wilson." The nurse directed us to a hospital room. The moment I pushed the door open, my heart missed a beat. Sarah was lying in a hospital bed, her face as pale as paper. Her head was bandaged, her left arm was in a cast, and her body was full of various tubes. I trembled as I walked over to the bedside and gently took her right hand in mine. "Sarah?" I called softly, but she didn't respond. At that moment, a doctor walked in. "Mr. Wilson?" "I'm a doctor." I nodded. "Sarah, how's it going?" The doctor's expression was serious. "Your wife's injuries are more serious. She has a slight concussion, a fractured left arm, and internal bleeding. We need immediate surgery." "Then let's operate right away," I said eagerly. The doctor hesitated. "The surgery carries some risk. The success rate is about 50%. We need your signature." I felt a wave of dizziness and held onto the side of the bed to keep from falling. 50% success rate? That meant there was a 50-50 chance that Sarah would. I didn't dare think about it anymore. "My advice is that you can talk to your family first," the doctor said. I shook my head. "No need. I'll sign it." While signing, my hands couldn't stop shaking. Looking at Sarah's pale face, I suddenly realized that no matter what happened, I still couldn't bear to lose her. The surgery lasted almost 6 hours. I paced back and forth outside the operating room, praying incessantly in my heart. At that moment, I suddenly remembered our first date, the little wrinkles at the corners of Sarah's eyes when she smiled. Our wedding, when I was moved to tears as she walked toward me in her white gown. Last Christmas, when we nestled into the couch and watched old movies, and she fell asleep peacefully on my shoulder. All the good memories came flooding back to me, and I realized that our relationship had long been so deeply rooted in my life that even the pain of betrayal couldn't erase it completely. Finally, the door to the operating room opened. Dr. Zhang walked out with a tired smile on his face. "The surgery was successful. Your wife is out of danger." I let out a long breath and my legs gave out, almost falling to my knees. Mom and Dad rushed to help me. Thank you," I choked out. After Sarah was wheeled back into the hospital room, I stayed by her side. Watching her steady breathing, I was conflicted inside. I was still angry and hurt by her betrayal, but at the same time thankful that she was safe. Late at night, Sarah finally woke up. She looks around in confusion, then her eyes fall on me. "Jerry, you're here," she said weakly. I took her hand. "Well, I'm here." Sarah's eyes fill with tears. "I'm sorry. I'm really sorry." I shook my head. "Don't talk. Get some rest. We'll talk later." Sarah nodded and quickly fell back asleep. I looked at her sleeping face with mixed feelings. I don't know what the future holds. I don't know if there's any chance of salvaging our marriage. But at this moment, I just hope Sarah can recover quickly. As for the rest, perhaps only time will give the answer. For the next few weeks, I practically lived in the hospital. Sarah's recovery was better than expected, but she still needed a lot of care. I took a long vacation and helped her every day by wiping, feeding, and changing her clothes. just like taking care of a child. Sometimes, when I brush Sarah's hair or read to her, I drift off into a trance where I feel like everything is back to the way it used to be. But every time that feeling comes, that heartbreaking image breaks into my mind again and pulls me back to reality. Sarah seemed to sense my conflict as well. One day, as I was peeling an apple for her, she suddenly spoke up. "Jerry, we need to talk." My hand paused for a moment, but didn't look up. "Well, go ahead." "I know I've done something unforgivable." Sarah's voice trembled a little. "But this car accident has made me realize how much I love you and how much I can't live without you. Jerry, please give me a chance to make a fresh start, okay?" I put the knife down and finally looked up at her. Sarah's eyes were full of anticipation and pleading, but I felt a wave of exhaustion. "Sarah, I don't know." I shook my head. "It's not something that can be solved by simply forgiving. You betrayed my trust and hurt our marriage. I'm not sure we can ever go back to the way things were." Tears came to Sarah's eyes. I know I made a big mistake. But Jerry, I'll do anything to make it right. We can go to marriage counseling. I can quit my job. We can move and start over." I took a deep breath. "Sarah, the question isn't about what you're willing to do. Rather, it's whether or not I can still trust you, whether or not I can still be with you without being tormented by those images." The room fell into silence. I stood up and walked over to the window. Outside, the sun was shining, the streets were crowded with pedestrians, and life seemed to be going on as usual. But our world had been turned upside down. "I need time," I finally said, "and we'll talk about it when you get out of the hospital." Sarah nodded and wiped her eyes. Later that night, I called Mike and asked him out for a drink. We sat down in a quiet bar, and I told him all about this time. Mike listened and was silent for a moment, then said, "Man, I know it's hard, but have you ever thought that maybe this car accident is giving you guys a chance to start over?" I laughed bitterly. "Starting over? Mike, you don't understand. Every time I see Sarah, I remember that scene. I don't know if I can get over this." Mike patted me on the shoulder. "I get it, man. But you guys have been together for so many years after all. If Sarah's really repentant, maybe it's worth giving her another chance." I took a big gulp of my beer. "I don't know, Mike. I really don't know." When I got home, I lay on my bed tossing and turning. Sarah's words, Mike's advice, and my own confused thoughts all swirling around in my head. Do I love Sarah? Even after what happened? Can I ever forgive her? The next morning, I went to the hospital with a black eye. Sarah was packing up her things and getting ready to leave the hospital. "Hey," I whispered. Sarah looks up at me with a shy smile. I helped her unpack and then pushed her wheelchair to the hospital entrance. Just then, Sarah took my hand. "Jerry," she said softly, "I will honor whatever decision you make. But remember, I love you and I will always love you." I looked into her eyes, which were full of sincerity and remorse. My heart suddenly softened. "Let's go home," I said, "and then we'll talk more deeply." Sarah nodded, her eyes glistening with tears. When we got home and stood in that familiar living room, I suddenly realized that this decision would change our lives. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew that I had to be brave. Whatever the outcome, at least I can say that I tried. I gave our love, our marriage, one last chance. The first night back home, Sarah and I sat in the living room in a breathtakingly awkward atmosphere. We both knew we had to talk, but neither of us seemed to know where to start. Finally, Sarah broke the silence. "Jerry, I know my behavior has hurt you and our marriage. I would do anything to regain your trust." I took a deep breath. "Sarah, once trust is broken, it's hard to rebuild, but I'm willing to try. We need some rules, though." Sarah nodded eagerly. "Sure, go ahead. First, we need to see marriage counseling. Second, you need to quit your current job and cut off all contact with that person. Finally, I need complete honesty. If there's anything else you haven't told me, say it now." Sarah bites her lip and seems to hesitate about something. Then she said, "Jerry, there's one more thing. That night, it wasn't the first time. We've been having a fling for a while." I felt a heavy hammering in my chest. I stood up and walked over to the window, trying to calm my breathing. "Jerry," called Sarah cautiously to me. I turned and looked her in the eyes. "Thank you for your honesty. It hurts, but at least now I know the whole truth. Over the next few days, we began the difficult process of rebuilding. Twice weekly marriage counseling became a regular schedule. At first, those conversations were always filled with tears and accusations. But over time, we slowly learned how to communicate better and how to express our needs and feelings. Sarah quit her job and started focusing on writing at home, which had always been her dream. I also adjusted my work schedule and tried to be home for dinner every day. We began to get to know each other again, and it was like being in a new relationship. One night, we were organizing our study together when Sarah suddenly pulled a piece of paper out of an old photo album. "Jerry, do you remember this?" She handed it to me. I picked it up and it was our wedding vows. We wrote them ourselves at the time, promising to love and support each other forever. Looking at those tender words, I suddenly felt a pang of sadness. "We were so young then," I whispered. Sarah nodded, her eyes glistening with tears. "Jerry, I know I failed those vows, but I'd like to renew my vows, if you're willing." I looked into Sarah's sincere eyes and a warmth flooded my heart. Perhaps starting over doesn't mean forgetting the past, but building a stronger future on top of it. "Okay," I said, "let's renew our vows." That night, we held hands and reread our wedding vows. Although our voices were a little shaky, our eyes were more determined than ever. Gradually, life began to fall into place. We learned to share more of each other's lives. Sarah would tell me about the progress of her writing, and I would share funny stories from work with her. We started cooking together and watching movies together, just like old times. Still, sometimes I feel a pang of unease when Sarah's cell phone rings, or when she comes home a little late. I know rebuilding trust is a long process that takes time and patience. One night we were in the kitchen making dinner together, and Sarah accidentally spilled flour all over her. We looked at each other and smiled, and suddenly we started sprinkling flour on each other like children. As we laughed and got covered in flour, I looked at Sarah's happy face and suddenly realized that our relationship was slowly healing. The scars were still there, but new skin was growing. That night, we fell asleep in each other's arms. Although there was still a distance between us, I could feel Sarah's body heat and hear her steady breathing. I know it's a long way to go to rebuild trust, but at least we're moving forward together. Our marriage may never go back to being what it once was, but maybe it will get stronger. Because now, we both understand the preciousness of love and the power of forgiveness. Time has flown by and 6 months have passed since Sarah's betrayal. Our relationship has had its ups and downs during this time, but overall, it is slowly getting better. That day, I was working in the company as usual. Suddenly, my supervisor Mike called me to the office. "Jerry, I have good news for you," Mike said with a smile. "Head office has decided to open a branch in Singapore and they want you to head up the program. It's a great opportunity for promotion." I froze. Singapore? It meant a move. It meant a fresh start. I need to think about it," I stammered. Mike nodded understandingly. "Sure, it's a big decision. You can discuss it with Sarah and get back to me by next Monday." I walked out of the office in a trance, my mind reeling. This was definitely the perfect opportunity. But what about Sarah? Our marriage was just starting to rebuild. Would leaving at this point undo everything? When I got home in the evening, Sarah was preparing dinner in the kitchen. Seeing me return, she smiled and said, "How was your day?" I took a deep breath and decided to just tell her, "The company wants me to go to Singapore to work on a new project." Sarah's hand pauses for a moment, then resumes chopping. "Oh, that's great. What do you think?" I sat down and rubbed my temples. "I don't know. It's a great opportunity, but..." Sarah put the knife down and came over to sit next to me. "But what?" I looked her in the eyes. "But what about us? Our marriage is just starting to get better, and I don't want to lose you because of this opportunity." Sarah was silent for a moment, then whispered, "Jerry, we agreed to support each other, remember? I'll support you if that's what you want." I took her hand. "But Sarah, it means moving and leaving everything here. You're just starting your writing career?" Sarah smiled. "Maybe a change of scenery would help my writing? And maybe it's just what we need. A fresh start, without the shadows of the past." I felt a rush of warmth come over me, and Sarah's words made me realize that maybe this wasn't just a career opportunity, but a chance for us to rebuild our relationship. Over the next few days, we discussed in detail the possible implications of this decision. We listed the pros and cons, researched the cost of living in Singapore, and even started learning some basic Mandarin. On Sunday night, we decided to go for a walk along the cliffs where I first found out that Sarah had cheated on me. As the sun was setting, we stood at the edge of the cliff holding hands and looking out at the sea level in the distance. "You remember," I whispered. "I was standing here that night and it felt like the whole world was falling apart." Sarah gripped my hand tightly. "Jerry, I will never forgive myself for hurting you, but I'm grateful that you gave us a second chance." I turned to face her. "Sarah, it hasn't been easy these past 6 months, but watching us overcome them together, I realized that our bond is much stronger than I thought." Sarah's eyes glistened with tears. "So, we're going to Singapore?" I took a deep breath and looked at the woman in front of me that I had loved for so many years. Despite all we've been through, at this moment, I feel a sense of peace and certainty that I've never felt before. "Yes," I said, "we're going to Singapore together. Start a new life together." Sarah broke into a huge smile, one I hadn't seen in a long time. We embraced each other with the gorgeous evening sun in the background. The next day, I told Mike about my decision. The next few weeks were busy with paperwork and packing our bags. It was hectic, but we were both filled with anticipation. Finally, on a sunny morning, we boarded the plane to Singapore. As the plane slowly took off, I looked at Sarah beside me with gratitude and hope. Our marriage has been through the toughest of tests, but we made it through. Now we are about to start a whole new journey. I don't know what the future holds, but I do know that as long as we are together, we can overcome anything. Because love, true love, is worth fighting for. And we, at last, know this. Thank you for taking the time to listen to today's story. If you enjoyed it, please like and subscribe if you haven't already. If you have a story to share about your own or someone else's experience, please feel free to contact me. Take care.